last several months, a crisis is brewing in Europe and in southern and Middle East Africa. What we have seen is one of the largest migrations of human beings across the face of the globe in the last several decades, as literally millions of people are fleeing Syria and parts of Africa and heading towards Europe. The purpose of this conversation is to discuss the refugee crisis, to talk about its causes, its effects, and maybe to have a brief conversation about what to do about the crisis and some of the ways that European countries and maybe even the United States can and should be handling it. Joining me today are my panelists, Jacob Lee, James Mark Kennedy, Lucas Pennington, and Sierra McGinnis. So let's start off with a relatively easy question, and I'll just throw this up to anybody to answer. What exactly is a refugee when we're talking about refugee crisis?
Well, a refugee is someone who has been forced out of their home by war or by persecution of some type, and there's someone that's trying to flee to get away from this circumstance that is in place.
How is this idea of a refugee different from someone who's just a normal immigrant?
Well, I believe immigrants, they choose to move, and they may be moving for one reason or another, but they are choosing to go to that country, where a refugee is fleeing out of necessity. They're fleeing a hardship in their own country, mainly war, natural disaster, persecution, like Lucas said.
Why are we seeing so many more refugees now than we have in years past?
Right now, it's a global issue. There are a lot of instances where conflict and violence is very prevalent in a lot of countries. For instance, a lot of media coverage here focuses heavily on Syria and its civil war. So it kind of highlights the refugee crisis in terms of those individuals leaving their country. But yeah, basically, we have millions of refugees globally, and they're all fleeing their countries for various reasons, as Jacob and Lucas mentioned, violence and persecution, things like that.
Is it that violence and persecution are relatively recent things in global history, or is there something specific about what's happening now, why it's happening? I guess I don't understand. It seems to me that violence is sort of part of the human condition.
True, but we're seeing an uptick in instability, both economically and in wars in the Middle East, especially due to the Arab Spring, which really just shook up the entire region. And now we have a civil war brewing in Syria that's just devastated really a whole region.
Yeah, definitely. And the fact that now that there's a bigger influx of refugees trying to flee their country than before, because there's always been refugees trying to get out and get to somewhere where they can prosper. But now that there's civil wars and conflicts between Middle Eastern countries and stuff like that, they're beginning to rise, and that's what's causing a big problem in the European nations.
So when you say causing a big problem in European nations, what are you referring to? What are some of the problems?
Well, it would definitely be they're having refugees come in, and they're taking over jobs, and they're coming in and they're displacing other people out of the community by taking jobs that may be taken by the European citizens. And some people see that as maybe a good thing also, because in some countries they need the labor force to be improved, and it's just a matter of opinion.
Well, kind of moving past opinion, what are some of the reasons why we think this? Are you suggesting that the refugee crisis might actually be a good thing? What's the argument that you're making?
In some cases, I would say it was a good thing, because in some countries, like in one of the countries that I read about, the average age, or the reproduction is going down, and that their population is slowly decreasing, and there's more older people than there are younger people, and therefore Social Security and stuff like that is taking over a lot of the profits, whereas if these younger immigrants or refugees come into the workforce, then they can help boost the economy in that way.
That's
Uh,
definitely true in Germany. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Oh, like he was saying, Germany definitely needs. They have a strong economy, but as their workforce is aging, they need these younger immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East because North Africa and the Middle East is young, and while we see in Europe, especially in Germany, the workforce is just older, and with native Germans not having the kind of birth rates that they need to have to replenish the population, you need these younger workers to come in there and kind of revitalize the workforce so we don't really see an extreme economic crisis.
Is Germany the only country in the world that you know of that's facing this kind of a population crisis?
It's the only one I believe that matters right now because that's really where refugees want to go is Germany because they have big industry, they have the economy to support more of them, and a lot of refugees have links in Germany from where they might have had family move uh, since before the civil war in Syria, and they kind of see it as a more welcoming place.
Well, I don't think it might not be the only one that matters because, I mean, the EU, the European Union and stuff like that, the president has set these quotas for immigrants coming in, and therefore I feel like it could become a problem for other nations because they're not ready for these immigrations, which is why the quotas have been set.
When you're talking about these quotas, what do you mean? Are these quotas for the number of refugees who are allowed into the country, quotas for just the number of immigrants in general?
No, the quotas are like the amount of refugees that they're going to allow into the country and stuff like that. Like it's also causing an uproar between the European nations also because some countries are allowed to choose how many they can permit, whereas others are given a specific figure on how many they have to let in to be in compliance with the agreement with the EU.
Who's responsible for setting these quotas?
President Juncker, I think his name was, the EU president.
So, kind of, I guess maybe backtrack for a little bit. We're getting into this conversation about where the refugees should go and who should accept the refugees. I want to talk a little bit more about this crisis itself. Is there anyone who we can sort of point a finger at and say, you or this set of countries is responsible for a crisis? For the crisis, can we say that the refugee crisis was formed because of the actions of a set of actors, or is this just something that's happening as a wave of history? Maybe perhaps like Mr. Lee had suggested, this is just a result of the Arab Spring. It's not really anybody's fault. What do you think? Who's to blame?
You definitely can't blame one party or one actor. We saw the situation in Syria kind of escalate because nobody in the West really wants to put, as they say, boots on the ground in Syria after, a decade of fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans really don't want to go in there again. Europe just doesn't have the wherewithal, I believe. Obviously, we see they're slow to act with the refugees. They can't come to a decision. You're not going to see lots of intervention in Syria, but the West probably could offer more aid and more intervention in the matter to help stop the war.
What do you think, Ms. McGinnis? Do you think that the West is somehow responsible, either because they caused the war, because they didn't try to stop the war, because they aren't providing a sufficient amount of supplies for the refugees so they don't have to leave in the first place? Where do you come down on this?
I know it's kind of tricky for countries to kind of figure out how involved they should get, what exactly they should do, that kind of thing. Like Jacob said, I don't think it's necessarily right or fair to place all of the blame on one country or one set of countries. As I mentioned earlier, it's a global issue that's ongoing, and it kind of blew up, and that's kind of where we're at right now. And something through different research, a lot of Western governments they do not encourage uncontrolled migration, or they're not as accepting of taking in refugees, that kind of thing. And so that's kind of showing a lot of or producing a lot more issues. For instance, borders are being closed in various European countries, and
Well,
so
we'll come back to this second, but I still
okay.
I kind of want to press this point for a second, because you said that when this crisis blew up, so you're saying that no one could have predicted this refugee crisis, that no one had any reason to believe this would happen, that essentially there was nothing wrong, and the next thing we know, refugees are streaming across the border. Do you think that's a fair description, or is this something that 2 or 3 years ago we kind of should have known was coming?
I think we should have known it was coming. As Jacob had mentioned earlier, the Arab Spring. After that, the wars in Syria or Libya, they began, and what I was just trying to kind of get to is that maybe the severity of everything and the extent to which so many people are flooding out isn't necessarily like aided by the hostility that a lot of Western governments have. I do think that we may have seen this coming, but I don't know if we predicted so many refugees fleeing from their countries, if that makes sense.
I agree. I don't know. We might have foreseen the war in Syria getting worse, but I don't think we could have necessarily foresaw ISIS, which is another reason people are fleeing in and around Damascus. I don't think we could have foreseen it being this bad and so many people needing to leave, or even having the means to leave. I don't know if we could have predicted 4 million people packing up and heading almost entirely on foot over to Europe.
If the European countries and the United States had better foresight, if they had known that the Syrian crisis, that the collapse of Libya, the problems in Eritrea, that this would result in the problems that we're seeing today, do you think they would have responded differently?
It's hard to say. Definitely, if they knew. I mean, we got involved in Libya maybe because we thought that instability there would increase instability elsewhere, but we don't necessarily have a great track record, especially in the United States, with dealing with humanitarian crisis very quickly or efficiently, and definitely is the case for Europe, because right now we're just seeing kind of a stalemate on the matter.
Okay, well then let's go ahead and turn to that stalemate and come back to this question of what do we do with the refugees now that we know that they're fleeing Syria and North Africa. What's kind of the status on the ground right now? Where are the refugees going? How are they being treated?
I know yesterday the EU had kind of a last-minute emergency meeting over the whole issue. European countries, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Hungary, they've been closing their borders to the refugees. And that's stirring up problems within itself because we have so many displaced individuals and trying to figure out where to put them. And I know some countries, I think it was Hungary, I think, has transit zones set up. And different countries that use trying to set up refugee camps for them to stay in. But a lot of those refugees do not want to stay in those camps, or they're still wanting to kind of keep pushing on and keep moving forward into the other countries. Like Jacob had mentioned, a lot of them are trying to push through and get to Germany, but the countries leading up to that are closing their borders. So it's kind of up in the air at this point. They keep fleeing and they keep trying to find solitude somewhere, but as we've kind of discussed, the countries aren't necessarily as welcoming to them.
Yeah, Hungary, definitely not. But that's one of the first countries they get to when they get to Europe. Mm-hmm. They'll get to Greece, they'll get to Hungary, they'll get to Serbia, those Balkan states. And the president of Hungary, Orban, he's definitely not been the most welcoming figure in this whole situation. Putting up billboards discouraging the migrants from coming into the country or crossing through. They're putting up razor wire fences between themselves and Serbia. They're criminalizing the border crossings, putting people into jail, deporting them back. It's just not a very good situation for those states kind of that are first hit. They're feeling it the hardest because they're having these thousands of people
Kennedy, I know that you've been having some technological difficulties, but I guess a question for you: Do you think we should be critical of Hungary and Serbia and some of these other countries for closing their borders, or do you think their actions are justified when you consider their economic and political situation?
I think whatever they're doing or attempting to do the lesser of two evils, because I mean they have issues of their own. That entire area has historically been a hotbed for tragedy, and there's just no way you can sit here back in your comfort in America, my comfort in America, and try to say that they're doing the wrong thing. They've got so much crap going on there that, I mean, I can't possibly tell them that they are doing the wrong thing. But at the same time, there is not enough of a focus on humanitarian effort, period, throughout the world, especially here in America. You know, it's all about profits and the amount of money it's going to take. I can keep going.
Well, Mr. Pennington, he brings up an interesting question. When you consider the debate we're having in our country right now about how to best deal with, well, I wouldn't necessarily call the immigrants in America refugees. We're trying to decide how to deal with our own immigrant problem, or the number of immigrants we have in our country. Is it really fair for us to criticize Hungary or other European countries for wanting to close down their borders? What do you think?
No, I don't. I definitely don't think it's fair at all, because I mean, it was noted that the United States is one of the countries that is doing the less amount of effort to try to combat this issue that's occurring, and I feel like that we have to clean our own slate before we can start judging other people.
So what proposals, and I think we started to get into this a little bit earlier when we were talking about this idea of quotas, but what sort of proposals have been presented for dealing with the refugee crisis? I mean,
well,
go ahead.
Well, first off, I mean, I'd say any proposal has to be oriented toward a long-term goal. We can't assume that in 3 months these people are going to be back home. We got to be thinking like 2-3 years ahead at least. Talking about establishing infrastructure and waterways and health care. That's a huge problem, is the health care that these people are receiving. Disease, you know, whatever, lack of immunization is a massive issue with these people. And the people in the refugee camps just aren't properly equipped or trained to handle that. That's got to be kept in mind with any solution. And I don't think it is. Like, Australia has completely the wrong solution. They're just not even letting them come anywhere near the country. They're given the option of going to Cambodia. But they're not. Australia is basically just taking a hands-off approach to this whole thing, which I think is wrong.
Yeah, we've been focusing so far today mostly on the European crisis. But as you pointed out, as I'm sure many of our viewers are aware, we also are seeing a refugee crisis from Southeast Asia. Mostly boat people who are attempting to make it to Australia. In fact, just late last night, early this morning, the previous Australian government collapsed, and in party elections, the former Prime Minister has been replaced by a new Prime Minister from within the same party. So one of the questions that we're all looking forward to the answer to is whether or not the Conservatives in Australia are going to continue to follow the same immigrant policy, or if they're planning on trying to change it in preparation for the next elections. So we have this idea, okay, so I guess one solution is to try to make refugee camps more habitable in the near term, 2 to 3 years. What are some of the other ideas that are being proposed?
Most of the ideas have been just centered around money. Everyone just wants to talk about money, money, money. Like EU saying, we'll pledge this much money to take care of the crisis. But that's only half the battle. Like, what is that money going towards? Like, if I know bureaucracy, I know half of that money is going to nothing. It's going to paper pushers and corrupt politicians. You know, we need to talk about where that money is going to and stop just talking about dollar amounts.
Yeah, we have to think in the long term with this. We got to make sure the money isn't going to corrupt politicians, that it isn't somehow ending up in the hands of smugglers trying to get these migrants across the borders. There's just all kinds of things that could go wrong with just throwing money at it. We need to think long term. We got to figure out if we want these people to stay in Europe or if the intent is to end the war in Syria, stabilize things there so they can eventually go home, or if Europe is their new home.
Mhm. Yeah, kind of going off of that, at this point in time where there are so many individuals that they're obviously fleeing for their reasons, as Jacob mentioned, are they going to stay or are they going to eventually go back? At this point, it's too late for the EU to create a coordinated asylum system, that kind of thing. Perhaps the countries kind of need to band together and give an alternative to the refugees. We have them stationed in camps and we're holding them there, but eventually you're going to have to let them out, and either they're going to keep moving or you're going to have to let them integrate themselves into those societies and become a part of those communities. And if they do decide that, then that's obviously going to bring up another area of tasks that the countries are going to have to focus on, in terms of housing them, making sure like minimum basics are met, that kind of thing.
Do you think the way that Americans dealt with the 500,000 or so Vietnamese that moved to the United States after the end of the Vietnamese War, do you think that that might be a model to Europe, or do you think that's sort of a uniquely American solution to a uniquely American problem? And it's open to anybody.
I think we definitely did some good things following Vietnam. Like, first of all, just getting out of Vietnam was just about the best thing we did. But I definitely would agree with that second thing you said, that it was uniquely American perspective on the issue. I think we're in a new age, and new kinds of weapons are around, new kinds of technology, new kinds of transportation, and we need to tailor a new solution to this new era.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that too, what works for us may not necessarily work for others. Our government system focused on that, did whatever they needed to do, but we have to keep in mind that it's not just one government over there. It's multiple governments, multiple actors trying to work together and figure out what's best. Everyone's going to they're going to want to work in their self-interest. So that's kind of where the difficult part comes in, is trying to find the solution that benefits everybody in some shape or fashion, but still aids those refugees. Because if we have to keep in mind, like the refugees, the EU, there's the Dublin regulation, which I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that, but it says like whenever they're fleeing, they can stay in the first European country that they come to until asylum claims are processed, that kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why the crisis is becoming so severe, is because there's so many people stuck in Greece or stuck in Italy. They're not letting them leave. They're kind of goes back to we're just holding them there. And so I feel like the EU, all of those nations, they need to figure out how to, I guess, disperse them, I guess you could say. Obviously, some countries are larger, they can take more people. Some are smaller, they can't. Others have more resources, some are more economically stable, that kind of thing. So there's a variety of factors that come into play when it comes to coming up with their own solution. But to answer your question, I don't think it's going to be as easy. And I don't necessarily think that what we did is going to be exactly what's best for that group as a whole.
Well, Sierra brought up a real relevant term, which is self-interest. I mean, in this case, when you hear about refugees, that should be the last thing on your mind. 1949, Geneva, we kind of all made a pact, right, that we were going to help out these war-torn nations with these refugees, and it shouldn't be about self-interest at this point. It should be about honoring that agreement, as well as just looking past ourselves and helping those in need, which is just not on our agenda, apparently.
And two, I think to your point, The fact that we're a federal system with a centralized government probably did make it a little bit easier for us to distribute the 500,000 or so Vietnamese refugees than what it probably will within the European Union, which is more of a confederal arrangement. So, again, getting back to the point that Jacob had brought up a little bit earlier, side effects. Assuming that these refugees to Europe or the refugees who are trying to flee to Australia, assuming that they're not going to be going home anytime soon, that this is a 3-year crisis or maybe a 2 or 3 generation crisis, are we expecting to see any side effects, Mr. Pennington, maybe side effects to Europe or European countries? Can we expect to see any side effects to the Muslim world or to the Middle East? What do you think is going to happen long term?
I definitely think it comes down to how the countries make it. Like, it is what they make it. And I feel like if they choose to integrate the refugees into their society in a beneficial way, then it could be beneficial. But I feel like if they choose to look at it as they're coming in and they're going to take opportunities and privileges away from themselves, then they could possibly not. It could possibly be a bad side effect, and it could show in the economic world and the day-to-day society.
How so? In what kind of ways?
Like potentially, like there could be that anger amongst the people, like amongst the people that are civilized in that country before, and then the refugees coming in. They could be like, it could be a division, and like the civil war that's already taking place, that's dispersing many people from their country anyway, could very much become relevant in the countries that these refugees are potentially migrating to, because it's causing that like tension between the two different groups.
And I think certainly from our own American history, when you look at the tensions between, say, the Irish or the Italians at various points when they were coming into our country, certainly something like that happened in the United States. These all seem to be mostly negative side effects, though. Do you think there's any upside to Europe?
I would definitely say there is upside to it. Also, because, I mean, I do feel like that these refugees, they have something they offer. They come in and they're a younger workforce. They're a younger population. They're going to be able to come in and do the hard work that maybe the aging populations of Germany are not able to do any longer, as we mentioned earlier. And there's definitely positives and negatives. It's just, honestly, I feel it comes down to what the people make it. And if they make it negative, then it's going to be negative. And if they make it positive, then it's going to be positive.
I think he's right, completely.
If these countries can help these refugees find jobs, put them to work fast, they can help booster the economy, help shoulder a debt that these refugees didn't help create. Putting them to work as quickly as possible would be the best, and it would help integrate them more easily into society. I think that should be the main focus of the EU crisis, mainly.
So on some level, this probably depends on the skills and qualifications of the refugees themselves and how valuable they would be. So I guess, just sort of thinking out loud, you may be able to, you may see an outcome where these countries aren't just fighting over how many refugees to take, but over which ones to take. A situation where Germany will only take the ones who are the most qualified for industry, that kind of thing. Well, what about the Middle East? We're looking at, in the Middle East, in North Africa, the loss of about 5 to 6 million people who have been forced to flee their homes and, in most cases, flee other countries. What do we expect to happen to Syria, to Eritrea, to these countries that are losing so many members of their population?
Complete and utter collapse. If this continues and there's no people there to govern anymore, you're going to see non-state actors continue to grow in strength and power because there's not going to be anyone there to stop them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's already a very destabilized region as it is. And this whole situation, if those individuals don't wind up going back, then, like he said, it's going to collapse. The economy will collapse. If conditions keep worsening, then obviously more people are going to exit the country. And yeah, so it's going to become more destabilized and then maybe just kind of break off completely.
Yeah,
I don't necessarily. I'm sorry, Lucas. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say I agree totally. I feel like that's why it's very, very important that outside nations come in and they try to fix the problem before it gets too too drawn out that it's not fixable in short term. Like, we still could go in now, and like, it's going to take time, but it's still very possible for us to go in and correct what's wrong now. Whereas if we wait longer and it gets worse and worse, then it's just going to be a more drawn out situation where we're going to have to fix it and cost more money, more time, and more human effort.
And then I wanted to add, as an American capitalist myself, I'm looking at this region, and let's say we have an extreme situation where everyone's gone out of these regions. So I'm going to go in there, I'm going to find the resources that are most valuable, and I'm going to stock that area with people that can help me profit off of those resources. I don't think those areas will collapse. I think they will reorient. I think there will be a shift in population, but I don't think they will completely collapse, not permanently at least.
I feel like unless the government as a whole can kind of rebuild itself in a situation, like in a way that makes the crisis kind of like simmer down or something like that, then I can kind of see what Jacob and Lucas were saying, that it will kind of shift away and kind of collapse. In terms of the resources, though, you would have to be careful that if they didn't lose too many people, that other countries would come in, cause more conflict, maybe exploitation, something like that, and then make the crisis even worse. So at this point, oh, sorry, you can go.
I was just going to say that I think I agree completely that it will collapse, but that just can't be permanent. This world's all about revolutions and cycles. It's not going to last. Just like America won't last, just like the dinosaurs didn't last. Things just come and go.
It almost sounds like you guys are making a case that the best long-term solution for stability in the region is that the refugees, at least a bulk of them, or the majority of them, kind of have to be forced to return back home at some point. Otherwise, the instability in the region would continue. Is that kind of the argument that you're making, or is that just maybe a consequence of your argument?
Well, I don't think anyone wants to use the word force, but we definitely want to encourage them to return back to their homes, and I believe they'll want to. They're not wanting to leave the lands in which they grew up in, but if they don't return, I think it could be devastating for the region.
Mm-hmm.
It also sounds like you're making a case that really the only way to end the refugee crisis is to somehow solve the problems in the countries of origin. Again, Eritrea, Nigeria, Myanmar, Syria, Libya. Is that possible? Do you think that it would be in Europe or the United States' best interest to try to more aggressively move to intervene in these regions? Or is it in their best interest maybe simply to accept the refugees and find some way to incorporate them into the population? Which way do you think they should go?
I think Mr. Kennedy mentioned earlier that we can't look at like self-interest and stuff like that. We have to do what's right for the humanitarian effort, and that we have to be able to show the people that, like, as Americans, I feel like it's our responsibility to take the first step to go in and to try to help to fix the problem, because if not, then other nations around us that may look up to us are going to step back and take that back seat and not try to help. So I definitely think it comes to other countries having to go in and collaborate. I feel like collaboration is the key point here. We all have to work together and not think about the negative. We have to think about the positive, and if we do that, then we're going to be moving in the right direction.
Yeah, kind of. Oh, sorry.
No, you
kind
go.
Of going
Ladies
off
first.
kind of going off of that. In terms of getting involved in those countries, I don't personally think that perhaps we should be involved heavily with like the military, troops on the ground, that kind of thing. If anything, perhaps this does open up a door for like diplomacy, international relations, that kind of thing. Before anybody, I guess, send troops into those regions, I feel like they need to work on those relationships, because if we go into Syria or Nigeria or anywhere with the mindset, oh, we're going to try to help you rebuild, but they don't want our help, they don't want us there, then that's obviously going to cause more conflict. And we don't want to make the situation even worse than it is. As Jacob had mentioned, we do encourage those individuals to go back to their countries. They obviously, when you're a refugee, you're being forced out. There's a reason they didn't immigrate somewhere else. So I feel like diplomatic relations, that kind of thing, would possibly be a good starting point for the EU or the United States to kind of embark on or kind of toy with the idea. Because we don't want to kind of come off to like we don't want to like bully them, for lack of a better word, into trying to reconstruct or trying to get those refugees back.
I think there's some really level-headed thinking, and I'd also like to add, we've got to think about the repercussions within our own relations that we're already fostering. Like, let's take Russia, for instance. I just read today that Russia has been putting arms into Syria. They've been supplying instruction on how to use those arms. So how is Russia going to respond? How are these other huge world powers going to respond to our aggressive actions? Maybe they have differing self-interests in these nations.
So if we're preparing in the United States for an election next year, and if we were going to be listening to the candidates talk about how to deal with the refugee crisis, in your professional opinion, which of the following three options do you think that America should pursue? One, should the United States go in and try to stabilize these regions to stop the flow of refugees? Two, should we establish a strategy of accepting our fair share of refugees, whatever that might mean? Or three, do you think our efforts should focus around providing a way of supporting the European countries who should be primarily responsible for dealing with this problem? Let's just kind of go around the table and what do you guys think?
Can I start?
Sure.
Okay. I think it should be a combination of the last two options. I think the first one should be just thrown out, completely discarded. This isn't some perfect world where we can solve everything with an M16 and a pair of boots. We've got to work towards working with other people. This is, this really could be an opportunity to foster lasting relations with the entire European Union. But I say 2 and 3 in terms of options because we have this land, we have all this land, 300 million people thereabouts. We have the land to accept some of these refugees, but at the same time, it takes a lot of money and time to transport them to America rather than getting them from Lebanon and Jordan into Europe. So that might be a good short-term solution where we can support Europe in doing that, but I think we also need to be taking some of these refugees as well.
Mr. Lee, what do you think? Stabilize, accept, or support?
Well, I believe we should just accept more refugees into the country because as of now, we've only accepted about 1,200 or so of these people seeking asylum. We could support the European Union, kind of help them keep on their feet, but they can only accept so many of these refugees, and eventually we're going to have to take them, or you're going to see a complete meltdown of whatever Europe's trying to do to try to handle the situation.
Mr. Pennington?
I would definitely say accept the refugees into our country and accept our fair share, but I would also add to that with accepting our fair share of refugees, we have to take the responsibility to try to play as a factor in the collaboration to get everything back to normal because, I mean, refugees, they're, like we mentioned earlier, they probably want to go back to their home and everything like that, so I feel like it's very vital that we help with the collaboration, take our refugees in, and when it's stabilized enough for them to return, then we allow them and help them return to their home.
Ms. McGinnis? Ms. McGinnis, what do you think? Stabilize, accept, or support?
As we mentioned earlier, like this is a global effort, multinational effort. I feel like personally the stabilization process does begin with us accepting refugees. Not only does that help us foster them and help them get back on their feet, even if that means integrating them into our society or just kind of housing them until we can their government is stable enough to send them back. As James mentioned earlier, it's important for all three of these obviously to happen, but I think the first step is to accept them.
We have just a couple of minutes left of time. Any final thoughts? Anyone have a final opinion about where they think maybe the direction of the crisis is going to go, or anything that you'd maybe like to add to the audience at home?
I just think it's a shame that this is, this conflict, this religious conflict that has just been a problem since time immemorial. The Crusades were staged in some of these areas, and I just think it's a shame that what's going on now is going to contribute even more to religious conflict that has ended so many lives, specifically between, Sunnis and Shiites. You've got Iran, backing Bashar al-Assad, and you got certain other factions backing the rebel fighters, and I just want to throw that out. That's a shame that that's going on.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, I think it's important for us as well as the viewers to make sure that we don't become too desensitized to this. We see this issue in the media all the time, and I know like some people, they see it and like they feel compassion or sympathy towards those people. They want to help them. They want the best for them. But where conflict, as you had mentioned earlier, conflict is inevitable. Violence has always been around, that kind of thing. With such a large issue, and it covers such a large span of land, it's important to remember that even though this is a large group of people, that there are families, there are children, there are so many generations that are being affected by this, and to kind of keep that in mind whenever you're kind of trying to help figure out if your country should get involved or not. Because I guess like food for thought, like what if that was us and those were our people? What would you do?
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think it's a very different problem when you're trying to consider what do you do with 5 million people streaming over your border, as opposed to when you try to think about what do I do with the child who just drowned in the sea because no one was willing to accept them. And I think we're going to have to leave it there. Again, I wish to thank all of my panelists for this, what I think was a very interesting and stimulating conversation on the European refugee crisis. And I invite all of our viewers to join us next week when the CU Seminar 2015 class discusses the Greek economic crisis and seeks to try to understand both its causes and maybe perhaps some of its solutions. Thank you very much.
Y'all.
See you next time.